Herr Prorektor, lieber Herr Riedel, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being invited here to ZiF. It's the first time I remember to have been here, but I know this place very well because this is my hometown. And I come from a little village nearby, and I spent many years as a taxi driver in this city, earning my money for studying economics at Münster University. Before we come to the financial problems, let me talk about the real side of this crisis. This photograph has been made the day before yesterday. It's Frankfurt. Lots of cars were burning in Frankfurt because the Blockupy movement had moved here from all over Southern Europe to Frankfurt to demonstrate how dissatisfied they are with the current state of the Union. And of course there are many more ugly pictures we have seen over the years. We are in the midst of a very severe real crisis, which is underlying and also the result of the financial crisis. I've written a book which came out with Oxford University Press last summer, and basically this is the story of the book, The Euro Trap. These are my questions. Some people believe we are out of the woods, think that because the current account's improved, everything is fine. Is it true? How did all this problem come about? The story of the bursting bubble, then the story of the loss of competitiveness, then the rescue operations, and my policy proposals. So let me begin. You have realized that the current account deficit, which peaked at 200 billion euros in 2008 for the 6 crisis countries, has improved. The 6 crisis countries are Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Cyprus. They all received help from European institutions. Some fiscal rescue programs, Italy only help from the SMP program of the ECB. So this was 2008, and since then it all has disappeared and we are in the positive range with the current account balance. Is this true? Is this a sign of improvement in competitiveness of these countries? What is behind it? Well, first of all, we must know that a current account is not just exports minus imports, but exports minus imports minus net interest payments to other countries. All these countries are over-indebted, and the interest rates have been reduced enormously. If we correct for that, I don't want to go into the details, this would be the curve. So with normal interest rates as they prevailed in 2007, by the end of 2007, interest rate being defined in a very broad sense, including all capital income, this would be the current account. Also, let's look at exports and imports separately. We can do that for all countries, but I just want to show you 2. This is Greece. Here you see that Greek exports have recovered a little bit since the crisis of 2009, but it's not overly impressive. They left their trend, and this is imports. And here you see that the gap has closed between exports and imports, but not because of a surge of exports. It was a decline in imports, and this is the collapse of the economy. Mass unemployment means that people have little income to buy expensive imports. That is behind it. So if Greece would recover, then we would probably see huge current account deficits again. Or look at Spain. Spain is a good performer. As you see here, the exports since 2009 have grown. They are about to reach their pre-crisis trend, but obviously it is primarily the development on the import side which has improved the situation. They have an export surplus largely because they have an import deficit. And that again results from the collapse of the economy. Unemployment rates. This is for comparison the German unemployment rate. You see here the peak with 12% in 2005. That was the German Euro crisis, little noticed outside this country, when we had increasing rates of unemployment, and the Schröder government at the time was forced to carry out very painful social reforms, depriving millions of Germans of their second-tier unemployment benefits, thus reducing the implicit minimum wage in the welfare system by reducing the reservation wage, the money which you receive by not working. So that helped Germany to recover. What about the others? This is Ireland. This is France. This is Italy. It's a major concern. Italy now has a rising trend of unemployment, with more unemployment than Germany at the time. This is Portugal. Things are improving, but the level is still very high. And this is Spain and Greece, with about 25% rate of unemployment. If you would look at youth unemployment, the figures would even be worse. The youth unemployment rate in Spain and Greece is about 50%. At times in Greece it was above 60%. What means an unemployment rate? It does not, of course, include the students in the numerator and the denominator they are missing. As always, it's applying only to that part of an age group which is available for the labor market. So it's a catastrophe. This is the reason why there are violent demonstrations and why people are dissatisfied. In Germany, everything seems to be fine. We are having a very good development. We have that development not despite the crisis, but because of the crisis. The crisis has meant that capital, which beforehand was leaving the country, is returning. Rich people are no longer daring to buy Greek government bonds or American structured securities. So there is a flight into beton gold, as we say. We had a similar flight in the 70s because of inflation. Now we have it because of the uncertainty of this world. Or you could also say the ships don't dare leaving the harbor in a stormy, when the sea is stormy. And Germany is the world's largest capital exporter, larger than China, with a current account surplus of 220 billion euros per year. What about manufacturing output? Here we have Germany. Germany has just struggled and succeeded in reaching the pre-crisis trend or level of 2007 after the collapse in 2009, where everything in this world collapsed, as you know. And since 2011, we have a sideward movement. So manufacturing is clearly not the reason why the German economy is performing very well, has been performing very well. It's the interior construction sector, which brings a lot of internal demand to the economy. Here we have Portugal, 12% below the pre-crisis level. France, 18% below the pre-crisis level. Italy, 25% below. And as you see, Italy here is in a triple-dip recession. The ball was falling down to 2009, then it came up in 2010, then came this terrible year 2011, when in the autumn Berlusconi had secret negotiations about the exit of Italy, as you can read in the book of Bini Smaghi, former member of the ECB Council. And then in 2012 came the whatever it takes of Mario Draghi that calmed the financial markets. 2013 was a little bit promising, and then came this terrible year 2014 when we had a slight decline again. It's at best a sideward movement in Italy. And here we have Greece and Spain, nearly 30% decline. Spain is often praised as a country which recovers. Yes, there is some recovery in the construction sector because they are allowed to borrow again. Also, the government sector has more money, but manufacturing, which is important for Spain because the northern part of Spain is very industrialized, has a sideward movement here. These are figures which we have seen in the Great Depression by the end of the 20s. The difference being that at the time rescue programs from other countries were not available, while now problems have been mitigated because, after all, unemployment benefits and things like that can be paid. And this is the big exception, Ireland. Ireland has a 20% had a 20% increase in industrial output last year, in manufacturing output last year. How did it all come about? It all resulted from the interest convergence which the euro brought about. These are the interest rates for 10-year government bonds, but similar figures can be seen for private assets. Look at this date. This is May 1998, the irrevocable fixation of conversion rates. And this is the Madrid summit of December 1995. You see, within only 2.5 years, we basically had this interest convergence. Why was this Madrid summit so important? While the Maastricht Treaty had generally stipulated that we would have the euro, the Madrid summit specified the timing. It said that by the 1st of January 1999, there would be a virtual euro and so on. And also the time of the irrevocable fixation of the exchange rates was fixed at that time. And, you know, while before this decision, investors didn't know what the value of the money would be, which they received when their bonds matured because of the exchange rate uncertainty. Every day we came closer to this date of May 1998 meant that the uncertainty was shrinking, and so the spreads were shrinking. That there would be another uncertainty in terms of potential bankruptcies of states was not yet in the mindset of investors. One country I forgot, this is Greece. Greece started with interest rates of 25%, and when it was clear that they could join the EU, which happened, the Eurozone, which happened in 2001, a little later than the others, then there was also this convergence from 25% to about 5%. The interest advantages here were so enormous that they gave a lot of relief to the government budgets. For Italy, for example, this is Italy, and the lower was always Germany. This is Italy, Portugal, Spain. This difference here in this period was 5 percentage points about. That was more, they saved more money than their total value-added tax revenue. Had Italy used this money to redeem its debt GDP ratio would be just 60% rather than 130% as it really is. So the countries had a lot of opportunity to really save, tighten, use the money to redeem the debt. But what they did was exactly the opposite. they not only used this money for breakfast, which they saved, they borrowed more. It was so tempting at these lower rates of interest to borrow. In Greece, the government was borrowing to increase the wages of the government employees and employ many more people. The consequence was that wages in the whole economy increased faster than productivity, and that the price level of Greek products increased. In Spain, it was more the private sector that could not withstand the temptation to borrow. People borrowed to buy real estate. There was a construction boom, lots of employment in the construction sector. 7 million people immigrated to Spain within a decade to help building the new buildings. And wages increased. Unions were able to increase the wages because of this increase of demand for construction services. So ultimately, also in Spain, it was credit-financed wage increases, where the credit was coming from other countries. And the wage increase here again was much faster than the productivity increase in manufacturing and in general in the economy, boosting the price level of Spain. And this enormous inflation, which was brought about by this process, deprived Southern Europe of its competitiveness. Of course, the relative prices changed. Export prices can only change a tiny little bit. Most of the development is the non-traded goods sector, but that sector delivers imports to the traded goods sectors, and the traded goods sectors lose their competitiveness. And here we now have the financial crisis. It originated, as you know, in America, but European banks had lost a lot of capital. They became more risk-averse and also asked higher interest rates in Europe. They shied away from continuing to finance these huge current account deficits which had built up during this period. And they even wanted their money back. There was a capital flight back home. The spreads peaked in 2012. Then came the promises of the ECB to do whatever it takes, the OMT program, and that calmed the situation somewhat, but not in Greece. As you see here, we again have spreads for Greece above 10%. You see the bubble also when you look at property prices. I show you a number of graphs here, all normalized such that their value becomes 100 at the time of Lehman. This is Greece. From 40 to 100, the price level increased by 2.5-fold. And then there was the sharp decline. Spain, similar development. Ireland. Cyprus, Italy. Italy had not such a strong boom, but they did have some bubble. Portugal. France is very interesting because they obviously had a bubble. They moved like Spain, except that bubble has not yet burst. And this is Germany. Germany is always the mirror picture of the rest of Europe because when the capital was moving south, the south was booming, Germany was stagnating. We had a long period of slightly declining property prices. And now, after the crisis, or in the crisis, it's just the reverse. This is the safe harbor effect. So investors invest in Germany and shy away from Southern Europe. The same reason which creates the crisis in Southern Europe creates the property boom in Germany. This superinflation deprived the countries of their competitiveness. Here I give you some calculations. These are GDP deflators, as published by Eurostat, relative to the rest of the Eurozone. This is one definition of real exchange rates. Let's normalize these numbers such that they all become 100 at the time of Lehman. This is Spain. On the left-hand side of the picture, there is the Madrid summit, 1995. And you see here Spain went from 80 to 100, increasing its relative price level by 25%. It is as if they still had the peseta and revalued the peseta by 25%. And that killed the Spanish manufacturing sector. Now, after Lehman, the funds which were making this possible, which came from abroad and financed the current account deficits, were no longer available. All of a sudden, they stopped flowing. And then Spain had to go into the back gear and compensate for the wrong prices. They had to become cheaper again, and that happened. During the crisis, they devalued by 6% relative to Lehman. But is that enough to regain their competitiveness? Well, it's not so clear what competitiveness really means. But if they wanted to reach this level, there would still be a long way to go. Would that be enough? Well, there is a model-based calculation by the economics department of Goldman Sachs. If we use their numbers, that is where they would have to go. The Goldman Sachs calculation is based on the assumption that the current account surplus in Greece becomes big enough to drive the net foreign debt position of that country, which now is about 100%, to less than 25% of GDP over 20 years. That's the definition of competitiveness, if you wish. Yes, they are on the right track, but it's a long way to go. Similar story for Greece. They devalued already by 7%, but that is where, in the baseline scenario, they would have to go. One can talk about these calculations. I mean, there are assumptions, they are arbitrary, but I can tell you we did some separate calculations about the necessary reevaluations in the European Economic Advisory Group, which come up with similar and comparable numbers. This is Portugal. Portugal has to devalue in a similar way as Greece, but they didn't. So you see here, they devalued until 2012, but then in 2013, they were allowed to borrow again. This created a little bit of Keynesian boom internally and reversed the price trend. You can always create a little bit of Keynesianism by allowing the countries to borrow. Then you have for 1 to 3 years, as long as you do it, you have some artificial demand for the domestic sector via the government expenditure. But it is, first of all, not the same as improving the competitiveness. And second, it undermines the competitiveness and the realignment in the country. Because if there is enough demand already from the government, why should you cut your prices to become competitive? This is France. France had an average normal inflation, but they still, according to that calculation, would have to devalue because they have a growing current account deficit. And this is Italy. For me, surprisingly small is this necessary devaluation by 12%, stemming from the fact that the Italian net foreign debt position at the time they did the calculations was already less than 25%, was about 25%. And here is Ireland. They did what is necessary. And this is Germany, the sinner. Germany became cheaper and cheaper and cheaper because we just didn't inflate. We didn't deflate, but we didn't inflate either, while the others inflated. All above 2%. And that made Germany, in relative terms, cheaper and cheaper. Germany devalued, and that improved its competitiveness, while the other countries had a similar problem. Now, in order to rebalance the Eurozone, all these things are necessary simultaneously. Germany has to go up, the others go down, given the price level. And of course, the price level doesn't have to be given. We can discuss at what rate of inflation on average we want to achieve that. I should say, since the Eurostat definitions or data are incomplete, it is not possible to recalculate these numbers in terms of averages, this part of the diagram. So it's always with respect to the rest of the Eurozone. There is some double counting in it. But if we do these numbers we can do in terms of averages, then Germany would have to go up by 20 rather than 30%. 20% up by the average. Greece and Spain, though, would nearly have to go down by 30% against the average. Why did Ireland succeed in carrying out a sizable devaluation? Actually, the peak here was higher. From here to here, it was 13% real devaluation. My interpretation is the Irish bubble burst 2 years before Lehman, and they were standing alone. There was no rescue program buying time for them, so they had no time to devalue. They had to tighten their belt, cut their wages and their prices, and that improved the competitiveness. While all the other countries came into the crisis simultaneously after Lehman, and instead of repeating the austerity policy of Ireland, they chose another policy, and that other policy was, as I will explain, to print the money which they couldn't borrow anymore. And that alleviated the pain for the time being. Another view on the competitiveness problem, here are the wages per hour in the manufacturing sectors of Eastern European countries, which 10 years after the Madrid summit joined the EU. In comparison to our 6 crisis countries. Compare Poland with Greece. You see that Greece has wages twice as high as Poland. In order to be competitive for, say, investors who want to open a factory, the Greek workers and the location would have to be twice as productive as Poland. Is it twice as productive? I see very little indication for this. This is the fundamental problem of Europe. And nothing what the ECB can do in the short run or the politicians can do can overcome this problem. Well, the ECB can inflate the Eurozone, I will talk about that, but it's not so easy to overcome it. Or here compare Spain with Poland. Spain, for me, is the big problem of the Eurozone, unlike what the public communication departments of the EU say. No one talks about Spain because it's too big to be bailed out. But Spain is really a big problem, having wages 3 times as high as Poland. There are now 4 dismal options how we can handle this. The first is we move into a transfer union. So we give credit, extend the maturity, reduce the interest rate to 0, and therefore gradually mutate the credit to an outright transfer. For Greece, we have done that. For 10 years, the interest rate is 0 and things like that. So the credit becomes, in the end, indistinguishable from a transfer. That will be expensive because 40% of the population of the Eurozone live in these 6 crisis countries. In Germany, the transfer union was difficult enough, but 80 had to finance 20. To repeat a similar thing with 60-40 in Europe is a completely different matter. Also, it's not so good for the recipients of the money because they would be driven into the Dutch disease. When the Netherlands found gas in the 60s, they had money to increase their wages, and that nearly destroyed, or at least handicapped, the export industry of the Netherlands. And only when the gas was out did that recover. East Germany is in a permanent Dutch disease with no convergence to Western Germany since 1995. The Italian Mezzogiorno has been in a Dutch disease for half a century. The second is we deflate the periphery, the southern countries. They inflated too much, okay, let them return to the same price level by deflating through extreme austerity. But that is difficult for two reasons. One is the Keynes reason. When Keynes wrote a letter to Churchill warning him not to go back to the gold standard, he said that it will be very difficult then to bring down the wages and prices. Britain would be overvalued, and the unions would object. Churchill didn't listen. Britain went to the gold standard and had its difficulties in the Great Depression. Exited in 1931. Germany was also in the gold standard and could not exit because, according to the Dawes and the Dawes plan, it had to repay the money in terms of gold-fixed Reichsmarks, so it was not allowed to devalue. It had to devalue in real terms by cutting wages and prices. From 29 to 33, the German wages declined by 28% and the prices by 22%. And that was the recipe to bring Germany to the brink of a civil war. And what happened in 33 was even worse than a civil war. There is an additional difficulty when you look at creditors. Mind that these countries came into the difficulty because they borrowed too much. So households and firms are over-indebted. If you cut their wages and prices, you may compensate the effect for normal goods which they buy, but not for credit. You cannot reduce the credit burden, and you would drive them into bankruptcies. That's the process which we are seeing in Greece and Spain. So prices can go up, but not go down. Third, we inflate the core, Germany in particular. Well, this is the policy which the ECB, to some extent, tries now, because Mario Draghi, when he announced his QE program, said he wants to increase the inflation rate from currently about 0 to 2%, slightly below 2%. Will that be enough? No. Such a policy would have to imply that the southern European countries do not participate in this inflation, and only Germany inflates. But if we don't want to go above 2%, then Germany would have to inflate by 3.5% for a very, very long time. In order to do the rebalancing of the relative prices, according to the numbers I gave you, Germany would have to inflate by 60%, which is 5% per year for 10 years. Yes, it's doable, but only theoretically. Apart from that, it is not clear whether such a policy will really induce the southern European countries to stand still and wait for Germany to inflate away, rather than participating in this inflation. And the fourth is exits. Exit is terrible once you talk about it. There is capital flight and bank runs and so on, all these ugly things, as we have seen in Cyprus. There was the huge capital flight from Cyprus in 2012, and only capital controls in spring 2013 were able to stop it. We now have 2 euros, one in prison in Cyprus and one in freedom in the rest of the Eurozone. The exchange rate is not 1-to-1. I have heard you just pay 80 normal cents, euro cents, for 1 Cyprus euro on a bank account in Cyprus. And we are close, in the case of Greece, to imposing capital controls because there is a huge capital flight. How have we handled the situation thus far? Well, the biggest rescue operations came endogenously from the printing presses. Everyone has the right to create money according to the rules of the ECB, every national central bank, and can lend out the money to the domestic banks according to the general rules. In Europe, money creation is different from America, thus far at least. Money is being lent to banks. In America, the Fed buys assets in the private sector. This lending to the banks is done against collateral. So the banks have to find assets in their balance sheet which are good enough to be acceptable as collateral by the respective central bank. The collateral requirement was A until Lehman, and after Lehman they reduced it basically to BBB. Well, this is a very simplified story. I have a full chapter in my book on the complicated, detailed measures to reduce the collateral requirements. There are many, many dozens of different policy actions behind it, but this is just a rough overview. And then, when the rating agencies declared the government bonds of Greece, Ireland, and Portugal no investment grade, that is worse than BBB minus, the ECB Council said, well, we don't care, we even accept these. Of course, they have always a safety margin they claim, and they adjust it daily, but in 2012, this was not enough for Greece. The market values declined so quickly that they had to move into ELA credit to avoid the catastrophe. Then they allowed non-traded ABS paper to be created. Banks could bundle their claims against the private economy and create an ABS paper out of it and give it in as collateral. Even though it was not traded, it was accepted as collateral. And then there was the ELA credit, Emergency Liquidity Assistance. This is a special form of refinancing credit which is given at the risk of the respective national central bank. That's at least the theory. And here the ECB center doesn't care what the collateral is. So the Greek central bank can print the money, give it out, and ask for whatever collateral it wants. This can be done unless 2/3 of the ECB Council object. So if you have 1/3 of the votes of the Council, you can do that. And as it happened, the 6 crisis countries always had, until Letland joined, they always had 1 seat more than this 1/3. So they could have printed as much money as they wished to solve all their problems, if they were unanimous. And now it's more difficult because we have the Baltic countries in, and now the ECB Council has slightly changed majorities. Here you see what this meant in quantitative terms. This is the monetary base of the gypsy countries, the money circulating actually in these countries. Banknotes, and in particular also the base money which banks hold with their central banks. So I speak only about base money, not about bank money. 100% is the total base money, central bank money, that exists in the Eurozone. This is the money circulating outside the 6 crisis countries. And this is the money made in the 6 crisis countries in the sense of originating from credit operations or open market operations in these 6 crisis countries. The difference is the so-called target balances. So that's the money which was made, say, in the South, handed out to the banks. The banks gave it to the private people, firms, and so on, and they used it for net payments to other parts of the Eurozone. And these net payments are being measured by the target balances. For what purpose net payments? Well, A, to buy goods, continue financing the current account deficits. B, to redeem the debt. Private investors from the north, our banks, wanted their money back, and therefore they were so glad about this. And C, buying assets. Actually, there's lots of Greek investment in London. One wonders where that money comes from. This is behind such balances. At the peak, in absolute terms, this was in the summer 2012, 1,002 billion euros, or 57% of the entire monetary base of the Eurozone. For Germany, it meant strange things. As you see here, this is the monetary base circulating in Germany. And this is the money created in Germany through credit operations. I call this inside money. And all the money circulating in Germany in 2012 and 2013 was outside money, to use the girly short term. Outside money, money created through credit operations in other Europe countries rather than Germany. And the Bundesbank had to issue the money. So when there was capital flight to Germany, for example, it meant that the Bundesbank filled the accounts on commercial banks owned by some other, by those who did the capital flight, and thus gave a credit to the respective other central bank which ordered the payment. This is an overview over everything. So these are the target liabilities coming from relocating the printing press, if you wish. If I talk about printing presses, please all electronic. This little bit of cash and banknotes is also included, but that's not important. Then there was the securities markets program where central banks of non-crisis countries were forced to buy the assets of the government bonds of the crisis countries. In total, it was 223, but these cross-border purchases were just 132.
Are these American billions?
No. Well, billions, sure, yeah, American billions. Yeah. Milliarden. 132 Milliarden. And here we have all the credit, the fiscal credit given to Greece. This program decided in May 2010, then the IMF money, the money from the EFSF, which was then created, the money from the fund which the EU Commission had, which it gave to Greece, and so on. So there are various items included. And then there is Ireland, and Portugal makes a total of 1,339 billion euros is public credit being made available for the crisis countries, of which 17% was decided by parliaments, and 83% were decided or allowed by the ECB Council. My criticism is that the major rescue operations come implicit through the possibility of dislocating the printing press, and according to the rules stipulated by the ECB Council, in particular the reduction of collateral requirements, which is a problem for democracy. the ECB carries out major rescue operations, and the parliaments are not asked. The parliaments add a little bit. They have problems enough to agree. They ultimately agree, but they are much more parsimonious with their money than the ECB. Think of what happens currently in Greece. A month ago, one was deciding about prolonging the Greek rescue program by another 4 months. So how much money was involved? Just 1.8 billion euros. And how much money did they get from the ECB? 60 billion ELA credit. And then there is some rescue operation which is not yet counted because it's a free of charge insurance promise, the OMT, which had a major impact on markets. The ECB said, don't be afraid buying, say, Spanish government bonds. Before Spain goes bust, you can come to me. I buy these bonds out of your portfolio. And that pleased the investors, reducing the spreads. Has not led, of course, to any number. But it's an insurance promise, and it is an economic value, even though we don't have the numbers for it. Let me come to Greece. This is happening now, as you may know. Mrs. Merkel does not yet know what she should do. Yanis Varoufakis said in the BBC, Greece does not have a liquidity crisis, but is insolvent. He explained that very clearly. He said, since 2010, we are insolvent. Everyone said we just have a liquidity crisis. It's not true. We are bankrupt. In German TV last Sunday, he said, we just have a little liquidity crisis. Why are you so parsimonious? He changed his mind. But that's what he said in BBC. How much money did they receive? This is the money from the printing press, so the extra money beyond the money which is needed for internal circulation. Money for the purpose of net payment orders, making net payment orders to other countries of the Eurozone. 91 billion is the current level. We just got this number 3-4 days ago. And 5 years ago, when we had the first Brexit debate, by the beginning of 2010, it was 48 billion. Then there is an extra credit from the printing press in the physical sense that they printed more banknotes than is appropriate according to their size, and therefore there is a liability imposed in the balance sheet of the Greek Central Bank. These numbers are all from the balance sheet of the Greek Central Bank. So they use the banknotes to go to Bulgaria, buy real estate there, and the Bulgarians buy German cars or whatever. But that's of minor importance. This is the SMP program, where other central banks bought Greek government bonds. And these are the public rescue programs decided in 2010 of the various kinds. So the total public credit given to Greece up to this day is 324 billion euros. It is not public debt of Greece. I mean, we have a creditor, we have a debtor. The creditor can be private, can be public. The debtor can be private, can be public. So there are 4 possibilities. What I talk about here is the credit coming from public European institutions being given to the Greek economy, be it private banks or being the government sector. This is 181% of GDP, or 35 Marshall Plans. The Marshall Plan, which Germany received after the war, meant credit for a couple of years. If you accumulate this credit over all the years and divide it by the GDP which Germany had at the time of the London Debt Conference, it was 5%. So 5% of GDP. And Greece has received 180, so it would make 36, well, actually, it's 35 Marshall Plans. Mind that the Marshall Plan was not the only help that Germany received. There was a 20% GDP debt relief, which Germany also received. And there could be hidden debt, which was not accounted anywhere, somewhere else in the picture, which we don't know. But the Marshall Plan proper was 5% of GDP. There are some people who say we should set up a Marshall Plan for Greece and solve the problem. This obviously makes no sense, this claim. This is also interesting. This curve gives the net foreign debt of the entire Greek economy, and you see it's about 200 billion, while 300 billion is the credit they received. So 100 billion obviously was exported right away. So that money was used to secure wealth somewhere else in the Eurozone. And did it help? This curve I showed you already. This is the Greek unemployment rate. At the first Brexit debate, 5 years ago, it was 11%, and now it's 26%. So obviously, the policy didn't work. How can one claim that this was a useful approach to solve the problem? I simply fail to understand. What are my policy proposals? I think, first of all, it's okay if the ECB tries its QE program to solve everything through inflation, as I explained. Let them try it. Maybe this is the solution. Maybe it's not. I don't dare to make a forecast of whether it will be enough. I think, at least before the program, when I wrote my book, I had different proposals. 3 basic measures. First, a debt conference to forgive part of the public debt, the bank debt, and the target debt that built up. So it's time for the creditors to face the truth and understand that they won't get their money back. Country by country, we would have to do the negotiations and see what they can reasonably repay and what not, rather than rolling over this problem forever like Japan did. Japan never dared to face the truth. Second, we will have to make the countries competitive after the haircut. It makes no sense to give a debt relief without establishing competitiveness. It depends country by country what that means. In the case of Ireland, there's no need to do anything. They are competitive. In the case of Greece, I'm pretty sure there's only one way to make them competitive: exiting, return to the drachma, and devalue the drachma. For Spain and Portugal, I don't know. For Italy, I'm confident that they can do it within the Eurozone. But you know, this is not, I don't dare to make any recommendations here, because this is up to the countries themselves, whether they want to go through the hardship of austerity or insufficient inflation, say, in the Eurozone, or whether they want to exit. But we should, I believe, make the euro more flexible than it is currently. The idea of having a euro like the dollar is a wrong idea, because we did not create the United States of Europe with a power center which would, if necessary, be able to command things that have to be done in the respective countries. As long as we don't have that, we can't really mimic the dollar. On the other hand, we should have more than a Bretton Woods system. Something in between, a more flexible currency union, a currency union where you cannot just enter but also exit without there being a catastrophe, because you stipulate rules for exit. And the exit would be anticipated, possibly by investors, if a country misbehaves, in a sense, which we can define, and this anticipation would imply higher interest rates, and the higher interest rates would be an incentive for the country not to misbehave. Misbehave, don't misunderstand me, I don't mean a moral term here. And then an exiting country could later return. So I would say in the case of Greece, why don't you exit, go to the drachma for 10 years, and then we see if when the drachma has found its new equilibrium value, return to the euro at the new exchange rate. How could this technically be done? I don't think it is so difficult. The difficult thing is converting the banknotes, so I think we should not do that. We should just give the banknotes, which the Greeks have in their pockets, to them, making it a Greek government debt, adding that debt to the other debt. It's only 20% of GDP. It's peanuts relative to the 180 which they already received. So then we can do the conversion overnight, over the weekend. We cross out all euro signs in private contracts, rental contracts, credit contracts, wage contracts, price tags, accounts on banks, and so on, and replace them with drachma signs, period. On Monday morning, it's all drachma. And then the drachma devalues. And mind, we solve the problem of increasing foreign debt with a haircut. That's my first step. And then leave it up to the Greek how quickly they want to print their drachma and succeed in doing so. They will do that over the coming weeks or months. For the time being, they can use the euros for payments. And when the drachma banknotes come, well, they come in addition. The government pays drachma from the bank. You get drachma banknotes. The euros are there. We have two parallel currencies, as in all of Eastern Europe or Turkey and so on. And the euros would be a gift. They could use them to buy goods. Some of the euros would move back for buying goods to the rest of the eurozone. Some would stay there forever for circulation, like in Turkey. So it's a very easy way of doing the transformation. For me, this exit is like a hospital stay. So when you are sick, you go to the hospital for some while, and when you have recovered, you return. I would even give the Greek a seat on the ECB Council and keep them part of the legal euro system during this period. Maybe a seat without a voting right. And I would help them with sensitive imports. So if medical products become more expensive, yes, we don't want to see people not being treated in the hospitals. That will also cost some money. But it will recover the Greek economy for three reasons. First of all, Greeks will stop buying agricultural products in net terms abroad. Currently, the import is 50% higher than the export of agricultural products, which is absurd. They buy tomatoes in Holland, olive oil in Germany, and so on. So they would go to their farmers, buy their products. The farmers would have more employment, and that would generate a stimulus for the economy. Second, tourists would return from Turkey. Turkey has basically the same beaches, the same products, but is much cheaper than Greece. So if Greece devalues, they return. Third, capital would return. The rich Greek who have brought their capital abroad would return at some value of the exchange rate back home because everything is so cheap. They would buy real estate, renovate it, and generate a construction boom. And hopefully they would not only buy villas, but also build factories. Perhaps the old cotton industry, which the euro destroyed, could return. But then I think a third step is necessary. We need harder budget constraints inside the eurozone to prevent this unlimited money printing to solve the problems. We should mimic the United States of America. The United States of America have target-like balances between the 12 districts of their system, and they have to be settled by handing over property shares in the SOMA portfolio of assets which the ECB gained by issuing money. Actually, America had a gold standard internally until 75. So until 75, the balances had to be redeemed with gold. Gold settlement between banks, where one bank asked the other to carry out a payment for them, was always the case in America. This is what you see in the Wild West movies when a coach filled with gold moves through the prairies. This is settlement of target balances. A system without settlement, where you can have an overdraft unlimited, is, I think, not very useful because it creates lots of more hazard effects and weakens the forces which bring about a realignment of relative prices. Okay, I'm finishing now. In the end, I think we should move towards a European confederation following the US model or even the Swiss model, as I develop in the last chapter of my book. But we should mind what defines such a confederation. First and foremost, a common army rather than common money. And this thing has to be on the table. And what it should not include is debt mutualization. There are two models of running a federation. One is a federation with debt mutualization. You mutually guarantee the investors that you will pay back the money. That drives down the spreads, and when the spreads are coming down, then there is a huge incentive to borrow. You limit this incentive by imposing political debt constraints. That's what we have in Europe. The other model is the liability model. So if a country borrows too much, investors should know that no one helps them in the case of crisis. There would be a bankruptcy and a bail-in. And therefore, they would not lend too much in the first place. That's the American model or the Swiss model. If California goes bust, there's no one to help. The ECB, if it came to America, would buy Californian government bonds under the S&P program, or would do the OMT program to bring down the spreads. California would issue more bonds and borrow. But they don't do that in America. The Fed buys not a single state bond of the separate states. It's only federal government bonds which are bought. So if anything, they have something like the QE, but certainly not the OMT program or the S&P program. And that has given them discipline. They had tried it the other way. They had tried debt mutualization. You know this guy. This is Alexander Hamilton, the first finance minister, who in 1791 mutualized the state debt, lifting it to the federal level. Then there was the second round of mutualization, 1813, in the Second War against Britain. And so everyone thought, well, you can borrow the burden of the debt will be shifted to the federal level. So they borrowed, built roads, canals, and so on. Some of the canals became superfluous when the railroads came and so on. But in the construction phase, it was a wonderful boom. The boom turned a bubble. The bubble burst in 1837. From 1837 to 1842, 9 out of 29 American states and territories went bankrupt. And nothing but hassle and strife resulted from it. While Hamilton had argued the debt mutualization would be cement for the new American state, Harry James from Princeton University argues it was an explosive. And he draws a direct line from the bursting of the bubble in 42 to the beginning of the War of Secession in 61. Only after, which of course had different reasons, the slavery problem, but the unresolved debt problem contributed to the tensions, he argues. And only after the War of Secession did America its new model of self-liability. And the local states imposed debt constraints, both. And that has given the American model stability up to this day. I think we should just mimic them rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. Thank you very much.